Ta-da! And this is our Twin Flames in Cinema Part 2 television shows. Take it away.
All right, thank you again for letting me present this tonight. We're doing Twin Flames in Cinema Part 2 television shows. All right, let's get this rolling. First things first, spoiler alert for the shows Smallville, The Flash, Doug, Happy Days, Doctor Who, and Power Rangers Time Force.
I appreciate that spoiler alert. That's great.
I
Although I hope there wouldn't be too many spoilers considering, the age of some of these. That's nice.
Mm-hmm. So we'll start with Smallville. If you're not familiar with it, it is not a Superman story, but it's Clark Kent's story. Specifically what it is it's the first 10 years before he becomes Superman, from high school all the way to about, I would say, around age 25. Pretty much late adolescence to adulthood. So we're starting up with our hunky protagonist right here, known as Clark Kent, played by Tom Welling. Fun fact. So what we're looking at is this is a very prolonged coming-of-age story. About the 6th and 7th season, it really develops into a spiritual story where Clark is identified as the Traveler. The Traveler would be like a kind of a space-age messiah type individual. On the show specifically, they say that he is on Earth to bring light to it. Hi, Amber. And along the way, he's the stereotypical individual on the hero's journey. His guide is his father, Jor-El, as well as his adoptive father, Jonathan Kent, who is played by Bo Duke himself, John Schneider. So what we're looking at from here, the story starts out with actually a false twin flame in this. That would be Lana Lane. So Lana is, for the first about 7 seasons, the primary love interest of Clark Kent. The entire series at that point revolves around him trying to win her over in one way, shape, or another. And it's always specifically a situation where everyone thinks they're going to be together. At one point, he assumes they're going to be together. At one point, she assumes they're going to be together, and vice versa. It goes all the way up until season 7, where she considers herself inferior to him because of his abilities, and she just disappears. She then comes back in season 8, where she is actually developed through the process of science an ability to be just like him. However, the outcome of that is it's poison to him. So she has to leave from that point forth. And along this whole thing, we're looking at Clark is he's always looking at himself. He's always looking at his destiny. He's not looking at his independent life. Even to the point where at one point he meets the 2018 version of himself, who tells him directly, hey, this is your purpose in life. This is what you have to do. And he also tells him who he's supposed to end up with. And that would be Lois Lane. So Lois Lane is put into the series around season 4, season 5, and she's designed to be, more than anything at first, an companion individual to Clark. She always puts him in his right place. They're very much friends from this point on, up until about around season 8, things start to shift from there. And what we're looking at is, when this is confirmed as season 8, there's an individual who comes from another planet who's named Maxima, and Maxima is, more than anything else, an individual who is looking for a Kryptonian mate, which specifically Kryptonian being what Clark is. At one point, she is kissing Clark, and Lois enters, and he literally looks at her and he's trying to explain the situation. And Maxima explains that their souls are connected. She literally says that their souls are connected, and that was the only way they could break the kiss. And this confirms the twin flame aspect between Clark and Lois. Prior to this, together they're what's called Clois, as the fans affectionately called the two.
Clois.
And
I've never heard that.
Clois, yeah. And what we're looking at is through about season 7 up until about season 9, they're partners. It's always a mystery between the two, and what I mean by that is they're reporters, so they're always looking for everything together at a professional level. And previously, during that time period, is when the encounter with Maxima occurs. And then, eventually, this leads to season 10, where Clark and Lois do get married. This actually happens off-screen because their wedding actually gets interrupted the first time around by the darkness, or dark side, which is literally the prophesized darkness that was supposed to enter Earth, that Clark himself was supposed to combat as the light. It was an interesting take they did with this, because they identified dark side as anything that has ever happened terrible in history can be attributed to him, like the Dark Ages, the Spanish Inquisitions, and they always said that there's always one there to push him away. And what we're looking at is, in this episode, this is kind of ruining the series for you, it's the last episode, I apologize, like I said, there are spoilers, but as Clark is battling the darkness to save humankind, it's Lois who is literally on the other side of the world telling government officials, don't nuke this giant thing that's coming at Earth, which is essentially Darkseid's haven, Apocalypse, because you're going to just kill people and you're going to prevent him from doing what he's supposed to do. And so together, working together, they save the world. And the vows. This is quite possibly one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen on a TV show. And in that same earlier part of the episode, Lois really doesn't want to marry Clark. She's feeling an inferiority complex to him, just like what we were seeing directly with Lana beforehand. And unfortunately, I cut it off. But it essentially starts out, I, Clark Kent, take you, Lois Lane, forever. Sorry, guys, I don't have the text for this, but you can find it on YouTube. Just type in Smallville, The Vows, and it literally has Clark reading it off. And it's beautiful. All right, next we're going retro, or pre-retro, with Happy Days. The stories itself, if you're not familiar with it, was a contemporary series focused on teenage and family life in early America. Early being like the 1950s and 60s. All right. So we start out with our main protagonist of the series for about the first, I would say, 8 seasons. That would be Richard Cunningham, or Richie by his friends. Specifically about Richie. He likes chicks. And he's a ginger. Whoops. Sorry, guys.
Uh-oh.
All right, so Richie's side of the story when it begins is... I think I missed this slide. Nope. All right, so Richie's side of the story is that he's acts as a confidant and moral compass to Fonz. Fonz acts as a confidence booster and just a friend in general to look up to who Richie needs. I don't have a slide of the Fonz. I guess I lost it through translation. But anyways, what we're looking at is this is the power duo up until, I would say, about the 7th season of the series, where it's always, for the most part, concentrated on Richie and how Fonz continuously goes through developing him into what a man should be. And likewise, Fonz becomes a better person for it. When we first see Fonz and Richie, Fonz is actually in a gang, and he's proud of that domain. And it starts into this situation where Fonz is literally going to beat up Richie because he sat in his booth at their favorite diner. And Richie appeals to Fonz's good nature and talks him out of it. And at that point, they become friends, and then the story progresses from there. And when you see a real solid connection between these two is an episode when Richie is actually in a coma. And you see a different side of Fonz in this episode. You see him praying. It's him alone inside the hospital. Richie's unconscious. And he literally turns and prays to God. And they show this in the episode, and he says, "Don't do it. Don't take away my best friend." And this is one of the few times in the entire series that you actually see a sensitive side to Fonz. And at the end of the episode, Richie does recover, and Fonz, in a very playful-like manner, looks up at the sky and does his traditional "Ay." And by the end of the series, we have seen a transition in both. In the very last episode, you see Richie. He arrives it's actually a guest spot because he wasn't on the series anymore, and he's a full-grown man. And Fonz, likewise, has just adopted a kid. And so
Wow.
you literally see someone who starts out as Richie was kind of teaching Fonz like the sensitive side of life, and Fonz likewise was teaching him how to be a man. And it kind of progressively was beautiful by the end of the series.
Wow.
All right. So next we're going to talk about Doug Funny. Doug is the star of the show Doug, and it follows the misadventures of a tween or teen as he travels through life. All right, so first off, we're starting with Doug himself. Doug is a socially awkward kid, and that shows in about every single episode there is, and he narrates his own story. It's through journal entries. Everyone starts out with "Dear Journal." And this is important to note because Doug actually lives very strictly in his own imagination. And along with that, all we have from the source of the show, in addition to watching it, is that Doug, as the narrator, is sometimes an unreliable narrator, but you don't really get that until you see it years later. And like I was saying, Doug sees the entire compass of what's happening in his life in forms of imagination too. Anything from his principal being too strict with rules, he'll see the principal as a dictator and he's fighting in some resistance. He's getting picked on by a bully. He sees himself as a superhero standing up against a supervillain, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting about that is in very many ways it's a law of attraction type thing, where he sees himself a certain way, and then he always progresses towards how he sees himself, and then there's a resolution at the end of the episode. So this is where Patty Mayonnaise comes in. So from what we've seen when the show begins, Patty Mayonnaise is the first woman or girl at this point, that Doug ever seems to be attracted to that we know of. He does mention girls from his past, but not like in a romantic sense, because when the series itself starts, he's about 10, 11 years old. And Patty Mayonnaise specifically operates by her morals. She's extremely sensitive but confident, and she comes with divided origins. And this comes into play later on in the series. You find out that her father is actually handicapped. He's paralyzed from the neck down, but he's very optimistic. He doesn't let it hold against him. However, if someone would talk against that, she would be vastly offended. There's also another occasion during the series when Doug makes an indirect reference about an old dilapidated building, and it turns out it was the house that Patty had grown up with her parents in, and her mother apparently died in that house, from what we see. And so Doug, being the charmer he does, actually goes back and retrieves the door knocker from this house that was deconstructed, but it turns out it was the neighbor's door knocker. But she still is moved by that just because of the fact that Doug made an effort to make her feel better. So what we're looking at when this show begins is, for the most part, it's a one-sided attraction. Doug, whoops, excuse me just a second. Doug, for the most part, is living a one-sided attraction from the very beginning. He's immediately smitten with Patty upon seeing her, not knowing her. He's just looking at her looks. From this, later on throughout the series, he develops more feelings as he gets to know her, and in his mind, he's already with her when he's not stressed. And what I mean by that is, if you look at his imagination and his fantasies, it's always a situation where he's winning over Patty, or he's making out with Patty, or some situation like that, except for when he's stressed. Whenever you look at his reflections of his mind, whenever he has upset someone, that's where his imagination goes. Until he brings it back in his own imagination to a situation where he's confident again. And like I was saying, throughout the progression of the series, it is a law of attraction aspect where he's just in his imagination to the point where he resolves his problems, builds up his own confidence, and even so, reflected in the series, it brings him closer to Patty. All right, so from what we're going on here, we have the first date, one of many. And this is a false timeline. And what I'm relating that to is, if you look at one of the very first episodes, there's a situation where he goes to a dance with Patty. However, episodes beyond that, it doesn't seem to ever refer to that ever again. And then what happens later on is, one night Patty randomly asks him out to a movie, and he goes, but he's confused the entire time whether or not this was a date. And from what we're seeing from this, you can, based on his earlier admittance of his imagination, we can assume that the first date that was early on at the dance didn't even really happen. Or he just wrote it off completely, and then we have a situation here where Patty has asked him out, and the whole time he's thinking to himself, with his negative aspects, is this a date? Is this a date? Is this a date? And the entire time it's a situation, it's actually pretty funny, where he's debating whether or not it's a date or it's two friends hanging out. So, if you're familiar... Whoa! Sorry, folks.
Retrograde.
So what we're looking at from here is, if you're familiar with the first series, it ends at his graduation. And then from there, the show actually picks up a few years later when they're in junior high school leading up to high school. And not 100% is revealed at that point. We do know that Doug and Patty themselves, Patty, for the most part, the first few hours of school, goes to homeschooling. And then she comes in at least after lunch, from what Doug says. Doug's imagination is not nearly as vocal at this point. You see like a few cutaway clips. But from what we know, from what Doug kind of shows, at this point it's almost his future self talking as opposed to his imagination in his journal. So from what we know, it doesn't know whether or not Doug really broke through the barriers, but from his point of view, it kind of senses that they do end up together. But like I was mentioning, Doug is an unreliable narrator, so we don't really have any solid confirmation from this.
What do you mean by unreliable narrator? Like he over exaggerates, or he like sees things a different way than they occurred?
The latter of the two.
Okay.
And from his own admittance, there's like an early episode where he kind of hints to the audience, I'm an unreliable narrator.
Oh, okay.
Alright, next we're looking at Power Rangers Time Force. In Power Rangers Time Force, if you're not familiar with this one, this was about probably 9 years after the original Mighty Morphin series. The synopsis itself is members of a law enforcement agency from the year 3001 travel to 2001 to 2002 to prevent a mutant fugitive from destroying humanity. How this one starts out. So, in the beginning, Alex, who is considered an elite member of Time Force, which is the pre-formed law enforcement agency I mentioned, is allegedly killed by Ransik, the latter of which two then flees to 2001. So what's unique about Alex is Alex has a special weapon that's calibrated to his DNA. And that comes into play later when Wes enters. So Wes is the ancestor of Alex. Alex's bloodline is directly tied to Wes, who resides in 2001. And as Alex's DNA was calibrated to the weapons of the future, they need the same thing directly from Wes when they find him. Prior to all this, Wes himself is just a regular rich kid. He appears selfish, but in reality he's acting out to rebel against his father. So what happens from here is the Power Rangers from the future, as you can see that little thing on his wrist, that's a morpher, which it gets calibrated and activates all their weapons as a security measure because Wes puts it on his wrist. Throughout the course of the series, he really develops away from being a rich kid. He becomes very humanitarian, and he becomes a natural leader more than anything else, and the reason why is because they need him. If he kind of shuns away from that device, they can't use their devices, which are the morphers that turn them into the Power Rangers. So from here, what's important was Jen. Jen is an individual who, in the very beginning of the series, is engaged to Alex. So from what we're looking at here is Jen is one of the people who goes into the past to specifically track down the individual who took Alex out. She's carrying a lot of heavy baggage because of this, and she's a career-driven woman. She considers her job in Time Force to be her duty, and she has an instant dislike towards Wes, and it's not really too obvious in the beginning, but she dislikes Wes because he looks exactly like Alex. And for a very long time during the series, she considers herself superior to the people of the past because of the reason that she comes from such a advanced society, and she doesn't see a reason to protect people that in her mind really can't defend themselves, when in the future anyone is willing to stand up for what they believe in, so on and so forth. And she kind of looks at society almost in a pathetic way because they're not prepared for what has arrived. So more than anything else, in addition to her duty, she holds a very personal grudge at Ransik for taking out Alex, but she does over time develop a sensitive side. So what happens with Jen and Wes throughout this thing is they've got like a very clashing type friendship going on. They know they have to work together because Wes is required for the purpose of Jen to do her job, but over time it becomes a very affectionate friendship. And while she's resistant to open up at first, Wes kind of allows her to talk about things that she's held up over time. And Wes is really proud about who he is, despite the fact that he wants to be independent. And she kind of brings that out in him by, teasing him about being a rich boy, and he stands up and begins to care about more people around him, including Jen, as opposed to being like spoiled and selfish. So eventually from there, Jen and Wes eventually reach a solid understanding of each other, and then they become close until Alex arrives. So we're led to believe in the beginning of the series that Alex actually died in 3001, when in reality he was just in a coma. So from there, Alex comes into the past and he takes over Wes's job. And like I kind of mentioned earlier, it's revealed at this point that Alex, who is Wes's ancestor, looks almost exactly like Wes. The only real difference they do in the show is they slick back the guy's hair. And from here, you see that Alex is kind of a false twin flame type individual. He's, more than anything else, he's just like Jen. He's career-driven. He's dedicated to his duty. And like her, he's holding a grudge. He wants to take out Rancic just because of what Rancic did to him. So from what happens here is they get recalled back to 3001, Alex included. And what happens is they're going back because they don't consider a threat to have occurred anymore. They, for some, I don't remember the exact reason, but they think that Rancic is indisposed. At this point, what happens is they look back at the timeline, which they have access to with the technology of 3001, and they learn that there was actually a counterattack in 2001, 2002, and it was Wes alone by himself fighting against pretty much an army, and he died alone saving the city. And at this point, what happens next is... Sorry, I went ahead of myself. What happens next at this point is Alex doesn't want to interfere with the timeline. He thinks it's in a solid position. But Jen wants to go back and save Wes. She doesn't want him to die alone. And at this point, viewers are reminded that Alex is actually engaged to Wes. Or excuse me, Alex is engaged to Jen. And Jen gives her back the ring and she says, "I'm sorry, I have to go back." And the rest of her team goes with him. And it's all of them fighting against Rancic. They beat him once and for all. And then at this point, the past is saved and Wes didn't die. Alright, so at this point, this is something I wanted to talk about in depth. So this is, by fans, considered one of the why didn't this happen type situations in the history of Power Rangers. So what happens is Jen and the others still decide they're destined for 3001 and they're recalled back to 3001. And this, more than anything to the audience, is kind of a reveal that Jen and Wes are twin flames. You can see the look in their eyes at each other when they want to kiss. You really want him to go with her or her to go with him, so on and so forth. And interestingly enough, when asked in a panel how they would like the outcome to be, Jason Font, who played Wes, said, "I would have told my character specifically to not let her go." And Aaron Cahill, who played Jen, said, "I would have told her to stay." So from this point, we look at these two twin flames who supposedly aren't destined to be together, separated, and whoa, I'm getting a lot of pop-ups today. Sorry, folks. So from here, what happens is Jen and Wes do this pretty intense embrace. Aww. And Jen leaves with her friends. Wes stays behind. Wes becomes a leader of the Silver Guardians, which is essentially a privately sanctioned police force to defend civilian life. And it's kind of hinted that the Silver Guardians are the predecessors of Time Force. And Jen goes back and lives her life. A year later, on a separate series, what happens is, as you can see, Wes is in his little Silver Guardians outfit, and Jen appears chasing another fugitive from the future. And they speak to each other, and Wes says, "Why didn't you speak to me? Or why didn't you let me know you were here?" Because Wes is chasing the same person. And she says, "I thought that if I saw you again, I wouldn't be able to leave." Build up, they end up catching the fugitives. What happens here, as we see the last instance, in the final scene is it appears that Jen didn't go back. You see Wes and Jen take each other's hand, and they walk out in a field together. And then from then on out, we only see Wes in the entirety of the series, mostly in reunion episodes. But by all hints, him and Jen did stay together, and that was how Alex became an eventual ancestor. All right. And did anyone have questions before I go on to the last two on here? I guess not. All right. So now we're going to talk about the Flash. So we have Barry Allen and Iris West. Barry himself lives with inherent abilities to tap into the Speed Force, which is a living dimension beyond time and space, accessed via acceleration. So an individual who can tap into the Speed Force essentially can go at high speeds naturally on their own. Other aspects of Barry, he's unsure of himself, and he's a nerd. Hold on, my leg is asleep. Oh my god. Sorry. And Iris West, who on the show is a confident young woman. She's always eager for the truth, and in this situation, she's Barry's stepsister. Prior to this in the comics primarily, she was a reporter who would end up meeting Barry. In this specific instance, it's Barry's stepsister. So what's interesting about these two, if you really pay close attention, is that there's role reversal. Iris has divine masculine features, and Barry has divine feminine type features. Barry is always an individual who is very caring. He's very motherly. And likewise, dang, sorry guys, my foot's asleep. Likewise, what we're looking at with Iris is she's very masculine in the fact that she's more outgoing, along with the fact that she's more likely to do things on her own or for someone else in an independent fashion. And if you watch the progression of the series, you see this continuously. Oh god. Sorry guys, very bad football asleep.
Are you alright there?
It's like at the point, you know that when you get it like where it's so asleep you can't even feel it? It's that.
That means it's gonna hurt really bad soon.
Yeah, I'm waiting for it. Okay. So this is very important what I'm about to say next. So they touched on this a little, and I'm kind of giving a lot away for later renditions of the show. I already know it, but it's really important to the story. There is a certain episode where Barry is running and he's not fast enough, and specifically he says to himself, Iris. And what happens is Barry progresses massively in speed. So we were getting a slight hint. But what's revealed in the comics is all the people who have access to the Speed Force, primarily the heroes, not the villains, access it at its finest when they address the person they love. So specifically, Jay Garrick always says that when he's specifically progressing, he will say his wife's name and he'll get faster. And the aspect of Barry saying Iris's name and then going faster and faster was a whole premise for a comic at one point. It was in Flash Rebirth, where he was literally running across time and stopping his nemesis, Eobard Thawne, or the Reverse Flash, from killing her. And he specifically said Iris, and he outran Eobard Thawne. And so, while they haven't tapped into it too much, the main lesson there is the person that you love the most is the person who allows you, when you're a speedster, to access the Speed Force the most. So from what we've seen even on the series, even in other dimensions, other worlds, Barry does end up with Iris. And in all those, that's the person he loves the most. And likewise, if you watch the show, she has shown it on a few of occasions, sometimes unsure of herself, as is always the conflict. But for the most part of what the audience already knows, they're destined to be together. And to me, him saying Iris and accelerating is confirmation of that. Alright, so now we move on to Doctor Who. So with Doctor Who on this one specifically, we're dealing with the Doctor and Rose Tyler, played respectively by David Tennant and Billie Piper. Alright, so in the very beginning, when we first meet Rose before we meet anyone else, Rose is just a regular girl. She works in a store. She lives her day-to-day. She's about 19 in the very beginning. And what happens is the Doctor enters the picture. The Doctor, if you're not familiar with the show itself, is a being known as a Time Lord, who specifically his genetics have adapted so that he can time travel continuously and also has hidden knowledge. With that, too, is the Doctor is an individual who always takes a travel companion with him. In the case of this, what happens to Rose is, at one point, she becomes a defender of the universe with him, and arguably at one point the universe itself. What happens specifically is she takes the life force of the TARDIS, which is the time and relative dimension in space, or his time-traveling device. It's in the background. If you can see it, it looks like a police box. And she takes it into her. She says at that point, she can see and feel everything. And she tries to make all the wrongs right, but the Doctor stands in and says, hey, can't mess with the universe, and so on and so forth. So what we're looking at is specifically when Rose actually meets the Doctor, he has a separate body. And what I mean by that is Time Lords have multiple lives. When one of their bodies dies, it regenerates into another one. The one she specifically meets is his 9th incarnation. We find out later it's actually the 10th. And it is what would be the 11th incarnation, or the 10th as we know it, that she begins to really fall in love with. Begins to develop real feelings for him. She can't see a life without him. They're each other's rock. They're with each other a lot. They confide in each other, and so on and so forth. And it's always a situation where he's like, tell Rose, and then he's like, never mind, she knows. Certain situations like that when they're in peril. So that what leads to this moment, which the next scene after this was actually voted one of the saddest moments in sci-fi history. But what we're looking at is there's an event where they find a direct connection between parallel worlds. And Rose almost falls into a vortex separating the two, but her father, who's living in the parallel universe, appears, saves her, and then the portal itself is closed off. So what happens here is the Doctor, who has literally saved Earth thousands upon thousands of times, is unable to save one person to keep her in our dimension, or our reality, or our universe, just one time. And she's trapped there, and he's trapped in our universe, and he has no access to her. And it's literally a whole universe that's separating them. So what happens here is the Doctor decides he needs to speak with Rose one last time. And how he does that is, as he addresses it, I'm killing a star to get this transmission through. So as a star is burning out, he's sending a transmission to it. And I don't know the specifics of it in all honesty, but it's allowing him to make a hologram projection of himself into that parallel universe where he's talking directly to Rose. And this is the moment I was talking about specifically, where he says to her, or she says to him first, I need to hear you say it. And he says, Rose Tyler, I, and then the star burns out and the transmission cuts. But we all know he was going to say, I love you. And so what happens from here is two things. First, prior to that, Rose does eventually find access back to that world, and she unites with all of his other companions up at that point to take out the Doctor's nemesis up at that point. From there, what happens is there's another situation where the Doctor injures himself greatly by taking in a bunch of radiation. What happens here is the Doctor reflects how each time he regenerates into a new body, he loses certain aspects of himself. Sometimes it's memories, sometimes it's feelings, sometimes he develops new feelings. So what he does is, in this episode, as his body's kind of decaying and getting ready to regenerate, he goes and watches his old companions. Some of them he addresses right forward and says goodbye to, but the last one he goes to is Rose. And from what he reveals is that he goes to Rose before she knew him. This is a good, probably about 6 months or so before she actually meets him. And he's leaning against the wall because of the fact that the radiation's kind of tearing apart his insides. And she finds him, and she kind of like pushes him off as a situation where he's drunk because it is New Year's Eve. And this specifically is New Year's Eve 2005. And he doesn't realize this at first. And then he says, New Year's, I bet you're going to have a good year. And then at that point, she smiles at him and walks off. And another thing I forgot to mention too was that on that parallel Earth where she still resides, Rose is actually living with another aspect of the Doctor. Specifically, it's a human version of him that came as a copy. And it has every feeling about him. The only thing is it's not a Time Lord, it's a human. So, in retrospect, they do end up together. Let's see. And that's it, folks.
Elfine. I love that. It made me laugh when I saw the slides. Yay! Thank you very much. That was awesome. Yeah, I brought up some things I didn't really think about. As far as Doctor Who goes, I know that Sean mentioned that he had a theory that it was another woman who was the twin flame. I don't know enough about Doctor Who to tell you.
Yeah, Doctor. You know, I think if we really broke it down and looked at Doctor Who, I think each one of his lives would be a different twin flame.
Right? Yeah, that's what I'm feeling.
I think that's the easiest way to explain it, because I could seriously do a whole presentation on Doctor Who. I don't. Okay. Hold on. I gotta step outside. I need to wipe my leg. Okay, sorry. So, I'm gonna take myself off camera. Hold on. All right. So, as far as the Doctor goes, I think the easiest way to look at it would be each one of his different lives has a different twin flame, which is a really unique way to look at it. Mm-hmm. More than anything else, because if I start with the most recent incarnations, that's actually a really interesting way to look at it. Sean specifically mentioned Clara Oswald, and after he said that, I kind of looked at it and I was like, he's got a very valid point. In that series, I'm giving way too much away for anyone who's never seen the series.
So this is a different series, Doctor then?
This is a different Doctor, yeah. The one I showed you, David Tennant,
right.
This is the Doctor after him, and then again the Doctor after him, who is with Clara.
Okay.
Likewise, Billie Piper, who played Rose Tyler, she was with two Doctors. The first one only lasted a season, but then went on. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, what we're looking at is there's the next Doctor actually is married to an individual named River. Oh my God, River Song. Sorry, all the Whovians watching this are like, "Oh God, I hate you." No, River Song, and but she's dead at the point when we meet Clara, or allegedly, because she does nothing but travel across time, just like the Doctor does. But anyways, it's so much to think about. Anyways, so what we're looking at is when Clara appears, she's an enigma to the Doctor, and the reason being is because he's met her over different timelines, and that shows directly in the show, but he can't really put his finger on why. He realizes it's all different lives. And so what happens is, in the transition to in the new series, he goes to his own grave, which is like a huge no-no for a Time Lord. You're not supposed to visit your own grave. A Time Lord specifically, their decaying process is separate from ours. What happens with them is their body decays away, but their essence, their soul, appears like in a solid timeline spinning around. It looks like a giant, kind of like really rough tree. And so that's in his case. What happens in this situation is the Doctor doesn't know why, but he's met several different versions of Clara. The modern version is with him in this situation. There's an old enemy of the Doctor called the Great Intelligence, which the easiest way I can describe that is it's an evil consciousness. And it says specifically, I'm going to step into that, and I'm going to make every horrible thing you could possibly imagine happen to you across your timeline. And so it does. With that, Clara recalls a bunch of situations over time where essentially she was where she needed to be, but she couldn't figure out why. And she doesn't have like a solid memory of her life. And then she realizes that this was the reason why. She was supposed to step in. And so what happens is this beautiful thing is she steps into the Doctor's timeline to save him, and every situation at certain times is her giving him the information he needs. It's like a twin flame guide type thing. Like, you see his first incarnation with the TARDIS, and she's like, no, take this one. You'll have more fun with it. There's a situation where he almost gets hit by a car, and a leaf falls on his face. And she was literally the leaf that fell on his face so he wouldn't get hit by a car. And then it goes on. It shows you, like, the entire timeline. So, yeah.
Interesting.
You have to, like, see the show to fully comprehend it, to understand it. Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. And it looks like Ambi just sent a question or something. Oh, she put, yeah, cool, thanks, Bo, cool shows. Okay.
Well, speaking of that, I've been thinking about it ever since you said you were doing this. I've been paying more attention to shows and being like, I wonder what that could be. I wonder if I'm seeing one in this. And I think I had mentioned to you, I was like, oh, what about Mad Men? To me, I don't know how many of you guys have watched it, but I could definitely see that
I wish I would have remembered that, because that would have been a very valid point.
Yeah, I've been watching the show, so I'm like, wow, I could totally see that dynamic between Peggy and Dawn, and it's really interesting too. I mean, some people may not see that, but I'm like, I really feel it. It's interesting that she's basically, spoiler alert, the only female that he does not get with during the whole show.
Yeah.
It's kind of a joke almost, so I'm like,
but she teases him about it. She kind of hints that, he wants to, and he kind of hints it, obviously, in that society.
Yeah,
no.
and just the way they work together and creatively, ping back and forth, and also just like they're not really afraid to tear each other down too, but not tear each other down. That might be the wrong choice of words, but you know what I'm talking about, like just heavy constructive criticism is what I'll call it.
Yeah.
They don't sugarcoat it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They're very direct.
Another thing I forgot to mention too was with the Power Rangers, back to that real quick. To give you an idea of how strong that relationship was, Aaron Cahill, who played Jen, and Jason Fout, who played Wes, they consider themselves best friends nowadays. Like, you'll see him on Facebook all the time because Jason Fout posts like everything he does, and yeah, they go to like every convention together as a pair. And so I thought that was interesting how like two fictional characters played by two people are now like really close in real life.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think someone had mentioned, who mentioned this? I think someone mentioned Breaking Bad. I don't know who it was.
I wouldn't be able to do that because I actually haven't watched that show.
I barely started watching it, and I could kind of see how some people, again, it would be two males involved. But the way, throughout the whole story, they need each other. They kind of propel each other, and it's kind of like a two-person deal. I mean, for drugs, but but also, in the grand scheme of things, I feel, just something I thought about. I don't know. I haven't really gone into it too much. I'm like, that could be a connection.
Yeah.
The Happy Days one was surprising to me. Yeah, that it makes sense. I hadn't seen up until the end either, so hearing the rest of that makes a lot of sense.
I know, like when I was making this was when I was kind of thinking about it, and I recalled the last episode, and I was like, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And everything. Yeah, because the show itself is like really crazy. It like started the whole jumping the shark trend and everything.
Oh yeah, they coined the term.
Yep.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And you're considering maybe doing like a Twin Flames in literature, Twin Flames in what was the other one in
Graphic novels.
Mhm. I think
Yeah.
that could work. I just think there's probably a lot of overlap, like because so many things get turned into movies, not to mention TV shows too. But I'm sure that you could there's some literature at least
Well,
that you could definitely.
I was thinking about literature, and I was thinking about Dracula for that. And if I kept it with just the books, I could do one or two things. I could do just the first book, or I could do the book and the sequel, which was written by Bram Stoker's like great grandson.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but either way, that would come up with a huge argument because is Melina Harker Jonathan Harker's twin flame or Dracula's? Because if you take away the second book, she would be Jonathan Harker's. But if you put the second book in there, she would be Dracula's. So it's like a huge debate.
Yeah.
But no, if I kept it strictly with literature, I think it would be a pretty cool one.
Yeah, I haven't thought much about that one, but I could see quite a few. The first thing that came to mind, and not even because you said Dracula, but I think of the Vampire Chronicles and Lestat and Louis. There's no way they're not. I feel like.
Right.
For better or for worse.
Yeah.
But of course, I would default to that because I love that. I love that Chronicles.
I could do that. I could do that easily. Maybe I'll put that in there and Dracula. But no, I was thinking Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
And don't forget Twilight, of course, right?
No.
No. Doesn't.
Some people have brought that up to me about whether or not I consider that a twin flame story, and I can't. I can't justify it. I really can't.
I can't either. I would just be like, who cares? Well, you have to have actual characters to have a story, so
Right.
Oh,
all the Twilight fans are like spewing hate now.
Yeah, probably. Oh my God. I'm trying to think of anything else TV wise that comes to mind.
Well, Annie brought up Mork and Mindy, and after she said that, I was like, dang, I should have put that in there.
Oh, that would have been a weird one because he was an extraterrestrial, right?
Well, the
So,
same things with Doctor Who.
oh,
He's
that's
an
true.
alien.
Hmm. Yeah, Mork and Mindy would be cool. I used to watch it. I don't remember enough about it to really determine it, but
Well, Mork and Mindy was a spin-off of Happy Days, too. A lot of people forget
oh,
that.
I think I remember hearing that. Now that you mention it, that's interesting. Who was it Mork that was on there then?
Yeah, it was that was actually what made Robin Williams like famous. Was Mork and Mindy. It's a hilarious episode. I don't remember the name of it, but it's almost like they keep it ambiguous about whether or not it was a dream because Mark does come back later on the show, and
Oh,
it's it's pretty much like Richie meets Mark, and Mark's like saying how he's an extraterrestrial and he needs to take a human to his planet for Obleem, and he's like, "What's Obleem?" And he's like, 10,000 years. And it's all this stuff where there's like this epic duel with Mark and his powers against the Fonz and everything. Oh, it's hilarious.
oh my
And
God.
like
Wait, was that
Mark's
after
like
Jurassic
sending.
Park?
What's that?
Was that after
No,
the
that was
extinction?
before.
Because that sounds like one
That
of
was
those episodes
yeah.
where it just gets crazy and you're like,
Oh,
uh-oh, what?
it gets crazy, and you're just like, I have no idea what's going on. Like he's at one point he's trying to bend Fonz's judgment, so he sends a chick at her. And Richie's like jumping in front, and he's like, I'm gonna sacrifice myself, Fonz. And he's like making out with her and stuff. Oh, it's hilarious. It's that the whole premise. Oh wait, I think that's it. That might be the episode with the devil. I forget, but anyways, it's funny.
Yeah, I did not know that. I didn't know it went all into that. Oh my God.
Yeah,
Oh, Roseanne would be another good one. I could see that.
yeah. Mark and Mindy. Dang. Amber Disney, did you guys have any questions too or input?
I don't know if Amber's going off mute tonight.
Amber's like 30 feet away from it.
Well, if not, we could wrap it up and stop the broadcast and have
Yeah,
super secret private
I think that's
hangouts
good.
afterwards.
Yeah.
That no one could. Well, thank you for putting that together. I really liked it. Was the slideshow was so much clearer on the TV. So, yeah, we'll have to stick with that if we can't do the screen share thing. Yeah, that was very interesting. Thank you
Definitely.
very
Thank
much,
you
and I'm
again
sure we're
for letting me present.
we're excited for the next rendition. Yay! Bye,
Hey,
guys.
bye, Lab Broadcast.